Hello, everyone. Thank you for tuning in. My name is Cindy, and I'm a program officer here at the Japan Foundation, Toronto. I'll be your moderator this evening. We'll turn the camera to Dr. Whaley very shortly. I just wanted to mention a couple of routine matters before we begin. There will be time for Q&A at the end, and if you have any burning questions for Dr. Whaley, please type them into the chat. We will do our best to get to as many of them as possible. If you lose connection to this feed at any point, please feel free to jump back on using the provided link. If we run long or you must leave early, rest assured we will be recording this talk and it will be shared on our YouTube channel in the near future. Please be advised that due to the age ratings of the games we will be discussing, you might see a couple of graphic images on screen. There shouldn't be anything too violent, but just in case, I would like to note that this talk is not suitable for young children. Lastly, there is a brief questionnaire linked in the description of this video. If you don't mind taking a couple of minutes to fill it out at the conclusion of tonight's talk, we would greatly appreciate your time, as your feedback are invaluable to us in planning future events. And that's it from me. I'll see you at the start of the Q&A. And here to introduce our speaker is Ms. Noriko Yamamoto, the Executive Director of the Japan Foundation, Toronto.
Hello from Toronto, Canada. Thank you for tuning in to a virtual lecture hosted by the Japan Foundation, Toronto. My name is Noriko Yamamoto. Today, we hope to shed some light on the growing academic field of video game studies with an in-depth look at 4 popular Japanese video game series. Whether you play on a console, a desktop, or phone, video games are everywhere. It is stress relief for some people and a major form of competition for others. Compared to literature or film criticism, video games are a relatively new area of media studies. We are delighted to shine a spotlight on this special topic, particularly because Canada is home to many young scholars who are making an impact investigating video games with Japanese origins. Guiding us today is Dr. Ben Wiley, Associate Professor at the University of Calgary. Dr. Wiley's research, which looks at identity and trauma in Japanese popular culture, led to a book that was published earlier this year, Toward a Gamic World: New Rules of Engagement from Japanese Video Games. I am pleased to say that Dr. Wiley is also a recent Japan Foundation Fellow, having returned from his fellowship this summer. We are excited to hear his insight and looking forward to reading all about the result of his fellowship. Without further delay, please enjoy his presentation, and I hope you will join us again next time.
Well, thank you very much to Executive Director Yamamoto for the very kind introduction. Thank you to Cindy as well for publicizing the talk and setting it up. And thank you to everyone who's joining us from Canada, North America, Asia, and around the world. I really appreciate it. So Cindy, we'll just switch over now to our main slides. So today we'll be talking about Japanese video games and the mediation of trauma. I'll begin with a little bit of background and inspiration, what brought me to this topic and sort of researching video games more generally speaking. I'd like to introduce you to 3 games, somewhat briefly, all made in Japan, that I think are doing interesting things with engagement strategies, particularly around social anxieties and traumatic events. I'll dwell a little bit on a particular case study. This game is The World Ends With You. It's a Japanese role-playing game from the year 2007, and end with some concluding thoughts as well as ways to look ahead as we think about writing and discussing video games academically. And I look forward to your questions and comments at the end of the presentation. So video games are a pretty big deal. They're a pretty big deal everywhere. And they're a pretty big deal, particularly in Japan, not just because the nation is credited with, inventing or at least revitalizing the modern medium as it stood on the brink of collapse, right, in the 1980s when companies like Nintendo and Sega came in. But as director Yamamoto, I think, hinted at, video games are deeply integrated into everyday life in Japan. Here's a picture that I took waiting to get into the Tokyo Game Show, the annual game exhibition that's held. This at Tokyo Big Sight. Japan was one of the first places where I encountered a video game that allowed me to play while I peed. Here is a urinal-based video game that you can find outside of certain izakaya and other establishments, particularly around Akihabara, called Toilets, that lets you compete with the strength and the amount of urine you produce, right? And of course, we have a wide variety of video game characters and video game worlds that we're familiar with. And all of these reasons, I think, are reasons to take video games seriously, perhaps maybe not the urinal-based video game that I mentioned, but within my field as a professor of Japanese studies, I found that until recently, there were not many in-depth studies on Japanese video games. And I found this to be a bit interesting, considering that if we go back to the year 1983, we find here Miyazaki Hayao, the well-known Japanese animated film director of My Neighbor Totoro and others, commenting here in 1983, the same year that Nintendo's family computer was released in Japan. Quote, "It was inevitable that Nintendo's family computer would replace the anime boom. With real games, more people could participate in the stories and probably derive a little more satisfaction from them, too." End quote. So the idea here, even going back to 1983, that while we tend to think of manga, of print comics as sort of the older brother to anime, right? And then video games as emerging later, that in fact games are closely linked to existing media ecologies in Japan related to manga and anime and other platforms as well. And in fact, for decades, while this work has not been translated until a little bit more recently, we see that Japanese cultural critics, Japanese media theorists, have long since involved video games in their own discussions of manga anime realism and of narrative consumption. Most notably, figures like Otsuka Eiji, who first wrote about manga and anime realism as a way of endowing comic book characters with life, drawing on techniques that were pioneered by Tezuka Osamu, to figures like Azuma Hiroki, who has responded to Otsuka in a way, suggesting with his own project on gamic realism that video game structures can permeate a variety of media, most notably literature. To more recent cultural theorists like Uno Tsunehiro, Saito Tamaki, Morikawa Kaiichiro, and others. I find Azuma's discussion of gamic realism, geimuteki realism in Japanese, to be quite interesting. Here he talks about game-like structures that permeate a variety of media forms, particularly literature, light novels, and novel-like games. Here, while someone like Otsuka Eiji would suggest that video games undermine narrative, the narrative strength of a work, because in a video game you can reset something, you can die multiple times, or maybe never die at all, right? That this undercuts the sort of narrative potential. right? Azuma, in fact, suggests that these sorts of gamic strategies, this gamic realism, we can find in the trope of time travel in light novels and novel-like games. So if Azuma is interested in expressing the act of playing a game in literature, my contention is that many contemporary video games from Japan use their own structures in a way to try to permeate the real life experiences of their players. And that by using these sorts of gamic techniques, it can be particularly useful for tackling social anxieties and traumatic events. And I'll go into a bit what I mean in just a moment. And part of the reason I think for focusing on games and social anxieties and issues is that for many years, games were largely left out of English language media studies scholarship. Or when games made in Japan did surface, they were either sort of hailed as bizarre oddities, quirky games. Here are a few pictures I've taken. The upper picture is a dog walking simulator game from Japan. So if you don't have your own dog, you can practice walking one in the arcade. Down below is a buddy of mine trying to get a real life ebi, a prawn, out of a UFO catcher. Or Japanese games have been problematized for their depiction of gender, sex, sexuality, ethno-racial difference, and so on. Something here like Mr. Mosquito, where you are a mosquito and fly around and surveil different family members. But these sorts of odd or problematic explorations into Japanese games was not my relationship to video games. I'm not the generation that grew up with video games when they were first invented, but I am exactly the generation that grew up with video games being an ever-present part of the home. I got my first Nintendo Entertainment System when I was around 4 or 5 years old, and I've been playing video games ever since. For me, one of the games I enjoyed very much growing up was this game, Dr. Mario. It's a puzzle game, but I found that the repetitive and slightly frantic gameplay actually proved to be paradoxically relaxing and provided me with a great method of alleviating stress, all from within the confines of a very simple game device. And today, for all the talk of video games that might ask us to model bad behavior, video games that might ask us to model violence or other morally questionable acts, there's a wealth of information and published research that's coming out from medicine, from the humanities and social sciences that attest to the positive aspects of video game play. Here are just a few examples. There are many, many others. This is in conjunction with UC San Francisco. The video game here is Neuro Racer. It is a simple racing game that was given to elderly patients suffering from cognitive functioning issues. And the results here, which were published in Nature, which is the premier science journal, showed that playing this sort of video game helped with the patient's neuroplasticity, that is to say, their multitasking skills. Elsewhere, virtual reality is being used in interesting ways. Here is an application, Cool, developed by Deepstream, which is used to treat burn victims by immersing them in a snowy, wintry, like wonderland, sort of to take the mind away from pain. Here in Calgary, Alberta, we don't need such a VR headset. We can simply walk outside. To games like That Dragon Cancer, which was picked up on the cover of Wired magazine, which was a husband and wife team who chose to make the experience of their young son, who was battling brain cancer, into an interactive game experience. So what we see from these examples is sort of two implications of video games and trauma. One that suggests that players can be patients who might be healed by playing games in one variety or another. The second, perhaps like something from That Dragon Cancer, suggests that video games might inculcate their players with empathy, with understanding, with an emotional reaction to something that is unaccustomed to them. And so I think we need to keep both of these sorts of ideas in mind when we talk about video games and the representation of trauma. And we must also not forget, of course, drawing here from Marshall McLuhan, foundational Canadian media theorist, that games, he's not talking about video games specifically here, are popular art, collective social reactions to the main drive or action of any culture. And just for fun, the image on the screen here is Mario from Super Mario Bros. 3 wearing the Tanuki suit, where when you press down and the B button, Mario transforms into a statue, but not just any statue. Here he is a Jizo Mario, the Bodhisattva Jizo, the protector of children and travelers. So you can see even just a little bit of Japanese culture here in an over 30-year-old video game, right? So I think we should also be attuned to the ways in which games reflect the culture and society from which they come, even if we might not see much on the surface. So I'm going to turn our attention now to introduce you to 3 games. You might be familiar with these games already. Each do something, I think, different with grappling with trauma and social anxiety. And so we'll start with earthquakes and natural disaster survival. This is a game series called Disaster Report. And in this video game, some of you may be familiar or played these games, others not, so I'll try to summarize briefly. You play as a disaster victim, and you must use limited resources to navigate and escape from earthquake and tsunami-stricken Japanese cities while rescuing other survivors and scavenging for tools and equipment. This game is part of a larger series. The initial video game, Zettai Zetsume Toshi in Japanese, the desperate city, the desperated city, was released for PlayStation 2. It was localized as Disaster Report, and there have been a number of entries in the series, most recently the 4th video game, which was for a period of time canceled immediately following the Great East Japan earthquake, the Tohoku earthquake that occurred. Here, the video game's designer, Kujo Kazuma, was profoundly affected by the Great Hanshin Awaji earthquake that devastated Kobe in 1995. Kujo wrote that he had lost friends in that earthquake, and he says, and I quote, "Earthquakes are much more of a threat and a reality than monsters and aliens, and I felt that it was a theme that fit games," end quote. Kujo's comments also suggest a tension between designing a video game as an escapist piece of entertainment, and all of the games I'm talking about today are mass market entertainment games, and as a game that might serve as an educational tribute to lives lost in the Kobe disaster. The main engagement strategy that this game uses is communicating a sense of vulnerability to players through subtracting character skills, limiting in-game items, and controlling the pace and progression of gameplay. We see this a lot in video games. Permanently or temporarily disempowering players not only heightens the challenge of a game, but it also alters the scale of the gameplay experience. In this case, it forces us to live through an earthquake simulation by reducing the catastrophe to a human scale. We play as Masayuki, a young man who, as you can see here, travels through these different destroyed cities. Unique to Disaster Report, as you can see here in the little box, is a series of blue squares. These are what are called QP or quench points. They are essentially a way of managing the main character's hydration levels. The importance of water and cosplay, if you look at the main character here who's cosplaying from the game, shows that as we play through this game, we constantly have to be aware of finding fresh water, saving fresh water in bottles in our backpack. And so players must constantly look for drinking fountains, sinks, water trucks, right? And this in-game action of sourcing or boiling fresh water uh, validates, obviously, the importance of water and other uh, food items during a survival situation. Later games in this series, in fact, included manuals that were created in coordination with disaster preparedness groups in Japan, so players could read through and learn techniques as well for strategies for surviving, perhaps during an earthquake. Throughout the game, you also meet other survivors here, and you are tasked with rescuing them. You also hear about their own stories, right? Whether it's a lost family member, whether it's somebody looking for a pet. Each of these offer varied and highly personal narratives of survival that work to destabilize or at least to reframe an impulse towards a collective remembrance of trauma. And once you beat the game, all of these sorts of choreographed, semi-choreographed interactions then become a series of photographs that you can view. So you can see that here on the screen. These sorts of photo album entries bear witness to survival moments in the game, and they also represent an interesting space where the player is both sort of present in them via their avatars, but also, of course, not, right, as these moments have been scripted by a video game designer as well. Turning our attention from disaster trauma now to anxieties over romance, intimacy, and family planning. This is a video game called Catherine, and was in fact one of the games that I first played that sort of inspired my work on video games. It is sort of one part puzzle game, one part dating simulation, and it is rated M for mature or Zero C in Japan. And I argue that here, the social issue being addressed by the game's development team is Japan's declining birth rate and aging population. In this game, you play as this character, Vincent, who's a young man. He's 32 years old, and he has a longtime girlfriend named Catherine, but he's has no real desire to settle down with her and have a family or have kids, despite her repeated requests. And one night, he begins seeing nightmares. The game tells us that if you die in your nightmare as a man, you will die in real life. And that sets out the excitement of the game's story. The strategy used here in terms of gameplay are self-referential and meta techniques that keep the artifice of the game visible, but also provoke critical self-reflection on the part of the player. So it's kind of an interesting game. Again, as I mentioned, it's a puzzle game. You can see here, if you've ever played something like Tetris or Cubert, you here navigate these sorts of towers, and you push and pull blocks as a way of scurrying up the tower. All the while, at a metaphorical level, right, we have the sort of maze-like trauma here that Vincent, the main character, is navigating. And at the same time, he is threatened by monsters that serve as warped reimaginings of spousal commitment, such as getting married. There's an evil bride character. Here you can see the child, or the terrifying fetus in Japanese, Osorubeki Taiji, a sort of newborn character that chases around and scares our main character. The way the game chooses to engage players around this issue is through church confessional scenes. As if this game couldn't get a little more strange than it already is, after you complete one of these puzzle levels, you enter into a church confessional where Vincent, but also you, the player, are polled with a number of sort of A or B questions about love, relationships, and personality. Now, some of these questions are clearly meant for laughs, like, is popping bubble wrap fun? Or could you have sex with an attractive ghost? I won't tell you what I answered when I played through. Others of these questions, though, we see quickly get to the heart of issues of intimacy and family planning in Japan. Is it okay to live with your partner without ever intending to marry them? How does a life of no responsibility sound? Is romance annoying? As you can see, as you play the game and you vote in these polls, they are then graphed in real time. If your console is connected online, we then see the results of these which show up. And the Japanese version of the game, you can also sort the data. The way you answer these polls shifts the narrative and brings about one of a number of different game endings. So here is a way that we are engaging players around this sort of social narrative by prompting them to think back on how they feel about these various issues. Metal Gear Solid 5, The Phantom Pain. And there will be a couple images in this brief section that are somewhat violent, just as a heads up. This is the supposed last entry in the famed stealth action game that was designed by auteur designer Kojima Hideo. It's a very long series with a long and winding and serpentine story that I won't summarize. Needless to say, you generally play as sort of a secret agent, a spy-like character. The Metal Gear Solid series has always been interested in sort of staunchly anti-nuclear rhetoric. And with this particular game, that becomes an element of gameplay as well, where an online mode in the video game tasks players with either commissioning or decommissioning nuclear warheads across various internet-connected servers. So here we actually have a gameplay mechanism of nuclear disarmament in the game. But with this game, I'm interested more in the representation of virtual violence. So this game was released in 2015. It saw a simultaneous worldwide release. And all of the sorts of Metal Gear Solid games have attempted in one way or another to integrate the player's own subjectivity into the simulation. The game's director, Kojima, has said a lot about designing the game. Here, writing, quote, "In the past, the United States was the center of the world where everything was happening. Hollywood continues to present the US Army as being the good guys, always defeating the aliens or foreigners. I'm trying to present an alternate view in these games," end quote. A common critique of video games is that when we have violent scenarios, they are cleaned up, they are void of horrific consequences, civilian casualties, and psychic devastation. I'm drawing here on a quote by Nina Huntman from the book Joystick Soldiers, right? Put simply, video game violence doesn't really have the weight it should to affect us as players. What's interesting about this video game in particular are strategies that are used to turn the game's narrative fiction, and indeed the virtual violence, into an experiential event within the player's own social reality. That is to say, to collapse the distinction between the player character and the player author, right? And to have the player perhaps attach a new sort of emotional standpoint to the violence on screen. Japan has long since experienced games in the arcade setting where we interact with sort of everyday objects, right? As a way to kind of bridge playing video games and interacting in everyday life. Something as early as Hang On, the motorcycle game that's here. But we might even think of something like Bandai's Tamagotchi or Pokemon Go, right? All examples of bringing video games out into the real world, whether we're using a sort of toy-like interface or an augmented reality interface. So that's the same sort of, I would say, approach that this video game is using to try to bring the stakes of violence outside of the video game. And generally speaking, the way it works is in this video game, you play as a big boss, this mercenary and secret soldier. You recruit soldiers throughout the game through this funny balloon system that sucks them up out of the game world. These characters then populate your base of operations. Here you can see Kojima has included himself as a cameo, right? But you've recruited all of these soldiers. These soldiers then become almost sort of like the virtual pet interface of Tamagotchi. You care for them when they're sick, you send them to the sick bay. You're reinforced with loyalty within the virtual game world, right? By these sorts of characters who salute you or greet you when you show up at your base of operations, only to then move, as we move toward the end of the game, with an act of virtual violence where the player is tasked with dispatching, with killing these very same soldiers that you have recruited and cared for throughout the game. And when the game was released, it's an old game now, there was also a companion app for iPad that you could use where you could monitor the characters as well, further bringing them outside of the game. So I'm going to end with a bit of a case study of The World Ends With You, a game that I think brings together technology, a video game system, narrative, characters, all together around social issues and trauma. I argue that this game can be read in relation to social withdrawal. Many people listening might be familiar with the phrase hikikomori. Popular awareness of this term dates back to around 1998 with a book by Japanese psychiatrist Saito Tamaki, Shakai Teki Hikikomori, Owaranai Shishunki, which was translated by Jeffrey Engels as Hikikomori, Adolescence Without End. This type of social withdrawal was loosely modeled on the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders published by the American Psychiatric Association. And the government of Japan has formally measured hikikomori since around 2009 in governmental white papers, and they estimated the number in Japan as around 613 as of 2019, although popular media reports often round this up to 1 million. Hikikomori, or shut-ins, have long been a source of fascination inside and outside Japan. In fact, this is not in any way a Japan-specific phenomenon, yet nonetheless, story features from National Geographic and the BBC, right, present this sort of tantalizing premise, right, that young people in Japan might be locking themselves away. And if you're familiar with manga and anime, you might be familiar with Takimoto Tatsuhiko's Welcome to the NHK, which is a well-known manga and anime work, also dealing with hikikomori. But as a 2019 story from New York Magazine made clear, this was profiling the world of American hikikomori. This is no longer simply a Japanese phenomenon, if it ever was, and it is something that is happening elsewhere. As one hikikomori puts it, quote, "My folks always bitched at me. You got to get into a good school. You got to think about your future. So I quit trying altogether, gave up on myself, so my folks would too," end quote. This is a quote from a fictional video game character, Beat, Daisuke no Joe, but you would be forgiven if you thought that I was quoting from, New York Magazine or another scholarly source. The game he participates in is this game, The World Ends With You, or in Japanese, It's a Wonderful World, Subarashiki Kono Sekai. Originally released as a portable game for Nintendo's DS system in 2007, it was jointly developed by Square Enix and Jupiter. The gameplay makes the most of the system hardware of the Nintendo DS and also the system capabilities. It also saw a direct sequel just a couple years ago. In this game, you play as the spiky-haired character Sakuraba Neku, an introverted teenager who believes that friends only trick you into exposing yourself and ultimately getting hurt. One morning, Neku wakes up outside of Shibuya Station with no memory of how he got there, and he soon learns that he has died. He is in kind of a limbo, an afterlife that is modeled off of Shibuya in Tokyo, but overrun with monsters. And gradually, as you play the game, the other residents all become brainwashed by wearing the same fashion accessory. So it's basically Shibuya. Neku has died in the real world, and in order to be given a second chance at life, you must pair up with computer-controlled characters who all represent different sort of formulations of disaffected youth or isolated youth. For example, there's Shiki, who is a Shibuya Kogyaru teen obsessed with fashion trends, but we learn she secretly hates her own body image. Joshua, a mathematical genius who's bullied with no friends. And Beat, the skateboarder punk I showed you just a few slides ago, who ran away from home after fighting with his parents. These characters are all isolated both emotionally and corporally because they're dead. And this is a playful way to sort of juxtapose loners, right, and people that are isolated against the extreme hustle and bustle of inner city Tokyo. And in fact, there's often no better place to feel alone than in a big city. Shibuya is well known for its scramble crossing. All of the tourists come there now and shoot, YouTube videos and whatnot, right? But like other youth-centered consumer spaces in Tokyo, such as Harajuku and Akihabara, Shibuya has functioned both literally and metonymically for broader social anxieties about youth in Japan. It's therefore, I think, a creative backdrop for this video game. We learn as well as we play this game that really, living in the city is not for everyone. One of the main gameplay features allows us to read the inner thoughts of different passersby in this video game by tapping on this little skull button. Here's one so-called psychic scan. Been so stressed lately. I really need some comfort, but I'm sick of people. I know. I'll fill my room with potted plants. Wonder where they sell the best ones. End quote. Another Shibuya resident. Man, I am so butt ugly. I wish I had a folding fan or something to hide behind. This is Japan. How hard could it be to find one? End quote. The World Ends With You takes this concept of negative self-thoughts one step further by providing a gameplay manifestation of anxiety in the form of the monsters that you have to battle. They're called noise, and they look here like sort of, animals or other kind of beasts. Thus, overcoming negativity in all of its personal and interpersonal manifestations is one of the key objectives of the game as you play through it. There are many reasons when you read governmental surveys why hikikomori report to withdrawing from society, and the threshold is generally for 6 months or more. Truancy, bullying, not fitting in at work, retirement. There is a growing subset of older hikikomori. Kimura Naohiro, and I have a quote from him here, is a former hikikomori who now runs the Hikikomori Shimbun that curates stories written about and also written by former people that have been withdrawn. This quote, I think, enjoins us to consider that withdrawal is not so much an issue of space, right, as people tend to think of, right, being stuck in your room, as it is an issue of connection. Quote, I don't think people realize that a hikikomori is someone who doesn't have human contact, end quote. So again, returning to our engagement strategies, right, and how do these games take up social anxieties, social issues? traumas. Here, there's a form of connective engagement, right? Ultimately, one thing that video games can offer players is a way of having meaningful connections and meaningful contact with people that you may never meet. To this end, mingle mode is an optional method of play that came out when this game was released. It uses the Wi-Fi connected feature of the Nintendo DS to allow people to roam around, right? And if you were in close proximity to somebody else who had this video game, your systems would connect, you would link up, and you could trade certain items and be rewarded with bonus points. Here's an example of that in a screenshot. You can see here that we've connected successfully with the player AC5-san, and we have now exchanged some background music from the video game and also received some bonus points. This sort of connective engagement reconfigures the game media, urban space, and the body as players might surreptitiously meet each other out and about in the real world, all without needing to exchange a single word face to face. And when you read sort of testimonies from hikikomori, right, like the one I just showed you on the previous page, many suggest that one of the fears of sort of venturing outside is encountering people that might lecture them or look down upon them for their life choices, right? So here's a way of interacting and joining with other people without really ever having to meet them. Taking this idea one step further, The World Ends With You is one of the few games I know of that rewards players for not playing it. The game makes full use of the Nintendo DS's built-in system clock, so therefore every hour, every minute, every second you spend not playing the game generates a proportional amount of experience points, and the longer the software is shut off, the more you're rewarded when you reboot. Today, we're very accustomed, I think, to mobile games, to games like, Pokemon Go that ask us to move around, right, throughout our world and to connect with video game items. But again, I think we need to think back to when this game came out. Here's a picture I took when Dragon Quest IX was released in 2009 in Akihabara in a plaza with a similar sort of Wi-Fi interconnectivity. And we can see a number of people here just sort of milling about, downloading, exchanging in-game items, right? All without really directly talking to each other. So this sort of proto gameplay, I think, was really quite unique when it was released with The World Ends With You. While it's impossible to know what players might do by turning off the video game, right? Turning off the Nintendo DS, certainly in keeping with the themes of the video game, it seems that the designers hope that this time might be spent making meaningful connections outside the game, in the real world. After all, this is the conclusion that Neku, the main character, reaches near the end of the video game. After the final battle, he confesses in his closing monologue, "Enjoying your world means making it bigger. I finally get that. You got to reach out to other people," end quote. And with that, Neku removes his headphones. He wears these sort of purple headphones throughout the entire game, which diegetically isolate him from all of the other human companions. And the game's title is redisplayed on the screen, only this time it reflects a subtle change. The world begins with you. For players experiencing social withdrawal, it seems to beckon them outside towards new human connections. So in my last, 5 or 10 minutes, I'd like to conclude with some thoughts. So I've taken you briefly through 4 different video games: Disaster Report, Catherine, Metal Gear Solid 5, and The World Ends With You, all of which grapple with different sort of social anxieties and traumas, and all of which I think find interesting ways within the video game medium to involve their players in these stories and in these emotions. Researching and teaching about video games is hard work, but it is worthwhile hard work, I would say. And I think it is work that we're now seeing more and more of. But I encourage, educators that are listening and colleagues that are listening to this talk to think about ways that you might be able to deploy video games, in your classroom alongside film text, alongside literary texts, right? And I think now we're seeing more and more really good work that's being done by young scholars, graduate students, and even established scholars centering around video games and Japanese video games more specifically. Japanese games, I would say, productively engage with social anxieties and traumatic events. First and foremost, not by faithfully rendering them on screen, right? I think you can get a sense for that for all of these games we've looked at. The graphics are not necessarily photorealist, right? There are many kind of funny and bizarre and intentionally humorous meta narrative techniques that are woven throughout, right? This is intentional, right? These games are inviting players into a humorous, into a self-referential, alternate reality. It's not a straight virtual reality. It's not a straight augmented reality. Instead, we're playing with this humor. We're playing with this fun, right? And in doing so, we're allowing players to rehearse their responses to many different problems, whether it's how we might survive in an earthquake, right? Everything from scavenging for water, which is a real life activity, to something that's patently fantastical, like sliding across a electrical wire on a clothes hanger, right? These are video games after all, to something like Catherine, right? Where we might be prompted to think and respond to how we feel about relationships, family, jobs. Engagement strategies and video games alone, I don't think can solve any real world issues on their own, right? This is something people ask. Um, but I think video games are a useful tool. Video games can simulate environments in a different way than literary works, than film works, right? Than television works. And in so doing, I think video game players, when they're prompted to reflect on the situations in which they are engaging, might have a more developed critical perspective on the links, gaps, and lesions between their real and their represented selves. And looking ahead, it's been interesting for me, at least, since working on this research, to see how both Japanese and non-Japanese games, as well as other media, have adopted some of these different engagement strategies, these different design strategies, right? For example, there are a number of games now recently that have come out that are dealing with ways of getting us to think differently, right, about violence on screen. Something like The Last of Us Part 2, for example, is a kind of protracted narrative experience of sort of trying to get us to feel differently about violence, right? Something like Kojima Hideo's newest game, Death Stranding, very much about these kind of connection modes that we saw in The World Ends With You, as well as other media, right, which seem to be indebted or at least interested in the strategies of video games, right? Netflix is doing quite a bit with choose your own adventure style, television programs, right? Something like the Bandersnatch episode from Black Mirror, right, where we're choosing the narrative and moving through the content, right? So I think we see not only the ways in which video games are indebted to literature and film, but also the ways in which literature and film and other media are increasingly looking to video games as well to make sense of how to tell these human stories. So I'd like to thank you all very much for listening to the talk today. This is the book I wrote, Toward a Gamic World, from the University of Michigan Press. If you're interested in it or in anything I talked about today, you can certainly take a look at the book or always reach out to me as well at the University of Calgary. So thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions.
Hi, I'm back. Thank you so much, Dr. Whaley, for that insightful talk. You made me laugh quite a few times.
Oh,
And
that's good.
and everybody in the chat also made me laugh. I'll have to show you the chat messages later. So please, if you have any questions for Dr. Whaley, feel free to type them into the chat and I will go through as many as possible. As we're waiting for questions to come in, I just wanted to mention that if you live in the GTA, and by GTA I mean Greater Toronto Area and not Grand Theft Auto, we have Dr. Whaley's book available to borrow from our library, along with a selection of other books about Japanese video games. Um, and if you're going to leave us before the Q&A, just a reminder to please fill out our questionnaire that is available in the video description. If you don't see it, I would recommend refreshing the page and it should show up. We also opened up questions on our event registration page. So I already have some right here, and I'll just try to go through, one pre-asked question and one live question.
Sure.
At the beginning, when you were discussing disaster report, you sort of touched upon this idea of censorship, that the latest disaster report game was censored after the Tohoku uh, earthquake. And we have a question submitted by Mother Base staff member. Uh, what do you think of the increasing levels of censorship in Japanese developed games? Specifically, Metal Gear Solid 5 had to be censored in its Japanese version, but the international version was not censored the same way. Um, did something happen recently that made the Japanese game industry censorious, and do you see any issues with that?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. I'm not aware of an increase necessarily in censorship. I think I do know the scene that was mentioned. The way things are censored are interesting, right? Oftentimes, a game that comes from Japan may be censored in certain ways for the character design, for example. Something like Soul Calibur has been censored due to the kind of eroticization of female characters and the look of outfits when it's moving from Japan to North America. By contrast, gore, like blood and guts, are often censored more in Japan. And so we can see that case with Metal Gear Solid 5 or with certain Resident Evil games. All of those are developed in Japan, but they have been censored in some way. So I'm not sure that it's necessarily that there's an increase in censorship. I think just the different sort of gaming markets and the different tastes lead to different types of alterations. With Disaster Report, it was interesting because that was a game where they halted development after the Tohoku earthquake. And you saw really a mixed response. There were a lot of players, including some from the affected areas, Miyagi, Iwate, Fukushima prefectures, that wrote into the game company. The company's based in Kanazawa in Japan, and said, hey, like, you got to make this game. We got a lot out of it. We learned a lot about, how to survive. So you saw both the really positive response, but then you also saw the response from players that felt that the game, could be perhaps immoral or it could be in poor taste. And so the game was paused, and eventually it was released. They resumed development and released it. So I think we see that even with these sorts of games that deal with these issues, even amongst the players, there's debate over whether these games are harmful, whether these games are helpful, and how best to navigate them.
Thank you. Let's go to a live question from Veronica. Do you know if any of these games, I'm assuming the ones you discussed tonight in detail, have been used within the context of therapy?
I hope not. No, so admittedly, these are all, commercially available entertainment games. There have been a lot of games and applications like what I talked about at the beginning of the talk that are used in clinical settings. I do know, of the games I talked about, that I've read, and again, this is sort of anecdotal, I've read, player comments from that have played The World Ends With You, and also Catherine. In particular, I read comments from players that um, had been cheated on in their own relationships, that found playing Catherine to be sort of a cathartic experience because it actually allowed them to play through different story paths and play through different endings, and in a sense, sort of play as someone who is unfaithful, right? So that sort of simulating aspect allowed certain players, to come to terms with their own relationships in the past. So I think you do find examples from individual players that have played these games and had certain reactions. I would be cautious to generalize beyond that to a larger audience.
Thank you. Now back to another pre-submitted question. This one's from Logan. Logan asks, in the blurb for this talk, you note that video games are quote unquote interactive frameworks different from literature and film. Is this interactive framework something the average person can engage with as easily as a film or book? Or do the unique traits of games make them reserved for gamers?
It's a great question, and it's one that I, come across in my own classes when I teach about video games, right? I mean, certainly we are all accustomed to reading books, watching movies, right? There's really not much of a barrier of entry there. I mean, perhaps if we're reading something in Japanese, we have to learn the language, right? But with video games, I think Logan's absolutely right that we have to know how to play them. We have to know how to manipulate the characters, or else players can get frustrated and players can quit. And I don't know how many times maybe you've played a game or played a game with a friend and somebody's gotten frustrated, and thrown the controller down or something, right? So absolutely, I think games require a different type of entry point, and that can be um, that could be seen as, sort of a barrier to entry. I think now there are more types of games than ever, and there's probably games for everyone, including ones that are really easy to play. But these games that I mentioned are all, as you say, kind of longer, more involved console games where you do have to, manipulate controllers and play for a long period of time.
Some of them can be inaccessible. I know I have motion sickness, and that makes
Right.
a lot of first-person games impossible to play.
Right. Yeah. And issues of that, as well as other issues of sort of accessibility, for playing games, which now I think studios are trying to do more with for people that, might have, vision or auditory or other sorts of issues. Right. So I think we've come a long way, but yeah. And, even teaching games, right. I mean, using a game in a classroom, right, for example, as a text, we think about kind of how hard that is to ensure that everyone, in a class can get to a certain point in a video game, and progress to that point so we can talk about it. With a book, it's very easy to say, okay, read chapters 1 through 5, but in a video game, you actually have to go out and experience it. So that's definitely a great point.
In terms of the content, the plot of the games you discussed tonight, some of them are quite depressing, as one of our commenters noted. In this way, and this is a question from Wolfgang, traumatized people often develop dark humor about their situation. Are some of these video games fulfilling the same function as this sort of dark humor?
I would say so, certainly. I think, I mean, Japan has a rich, literary tradition and film tradition that deal with trauma and works that have been written by minority writers and others, right? So oftentimes when we read Japanese literature, students often pick up on the sort of, downbeat endings or inconclusive endings of lots of works of Japanese literature. And so these games as well can be somewhat depressing. a lot of the games have multiple endings. So you can have a sad ending or a happy ending, depending on how you play through it. But I think the point is really a great one. And what we see, I think, with the designers is they're intentionally trying to inject levity, inject fun, inject this kind of bizarreness into these heavy scenarios, right? And that's something I think that we see somewhat differently than when we're playing through similar scenarios in Western designed video games, right? I think the Japanese games really have this kind of sense of play and humor about them. And I think that's one of the reasons why they can be, effective for grappling with these different issues.
That's interesting. A commenter noted that they bought Catherine on Steam, and all the funny questions that you mentioned, like bubble wrap, were left out. So I'm wondering if over time, with localization, they sort of changed some things around.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of these games a lot of video games do get re-released, for different systems. Catherine, they did a re-release of the Catherine full body. That's not my title. That's the title of the game. And so they may have changed up some of the questions. Ditto for The World Ends With You when they re-released that game on the Nintendo Switch. It did away with that interesting mechanism I was talking about, right, of connecting the systems and walking around that mingle mode, because all of a sudden you can't really do that with the Nintendo Switch. So,
I see.
So as the games do get re-released or sequels, we do see that some of the functionality changes, right? And I think we can see that with Catherine and also with The World Ends With You.
And then the way we interact with them also changes.
Changes, yeah, exactly. And the way we experience it, right? If you play it on Steam and you're playing it on a computer, that might be different than if you're playing it on, a PlayStation. And so, yeah, the platform and the mechanism that we use changes the game as well. Yeah.
Okay, let's go to another pre-submitted question. This one, I've sort of summarized questions from Silas and Sarah. They're two separate questions, but they're both about violence in video games. And so this is my, hopefully, succinct summary of the question itself. Many video games are famously violent and graphic, and in the West, there still exists this perception that video game violence can lead to real-life violent behaviors, even though studies have shown this is not the case. In your opinion, how can society navigate these narratives that normalize violence as the only viable option for conflict resolution? And if Japanese games can help players process trauma despite violence, is that evidence of a cultural gap between Japan and North America regarding the function of violent video games?
Right. Yeah, they're great questions. Yeah, to kind of pick up on a few of those issues. I think, violence in video games is a gigantic issue. As mentioned, I mean, there are lots of different studies. At best, I think we've seen that, playing a hyper violent game might lead to a temporary, increase in aggression, particularly among, young male players as they measured it in a clinical setting, but it usually subsides very quickly. Of course, films, books, television shows can be incredibly violent as well. I think that, one thing is that games require us to interact with them over 10, 20, 30 hours, and they require us to do things, in the game, right? And we've seen, I think, a reliance on, shooting and fighting and other sorts of activities to keep, players engaged over these sorts of periods of time. And even in something like, Disaster Report, the end of that game, you end up at the top of a tower that's collapsing and the bad guys have guns, and it kind of fits back in with this sort of action movie style, right? So I think that we see violence in games somewhat as an activity, to do. I think what we're seeing is lots of games, though, that are now, experimenting with other modes of play, right? Games either that don't take up, violence in any way, games that are more, exploration based. You might think of a game like Flower or Journey for PlayStation, right? And there are lots of video games, I think, that are eschewing those kind of traditional, fight sort of mentality. Um, and so it depends, I think, the genre you look at. And I think that, you know, for for Japanese made games, I think we still see, a little bit of a gap. I mean, certainly there are violence in games, but I think it's handled perhaps somewhat differently. There might be more of an emphasis on, fantasy, for example. Even something like Metal Gear Solid 5, which is dealing with, nuclear proliferation. If we look at something like the Call of Duty series, in the West, we see a real graphic depiction of, an atomic blast in that game and the immediate effects of a character dying from that. So even when we're representing the same subject matter, right? The Metal Gear Solid game is doing it through an online mode, which is meant to kind of, decommission warheads. So I think we're still getting at the topic differently, even if it's present, in both types of games.
Thank you. Sometimes I think the violence inherent in games don't necessarily draw violent response, but other games that might not be violent do draw violent or aggressive responses.
And
I
I
know.
think, yeah. And I think there are many levels of identification with games, right? And it's not, I mean, different players are not going to experience, a game necessarily um, the same way, right? And I think that's part of the interesting aspect of a game, is you can play a game like Catherine and you can identify, with Vincent, or you can identify with his girlfriend Catherine, or you can identify with the young Catherine that he starts, having a relationship with, right? So I think, the identification lines are messy, and I think even though we see, problematic depictions of violence or ethno-racial difference or gender, sex, and sexuality, I think we also have to stay attuned, to what the game is doing on a whole, right? And the ways in which it might be trying to, in fact, overturn some of those narratives.
I have a couple of questions that are not directly related to the conversation, but let's see if we can get somewhere with them. Um, Deli asks, have you found that this reflection of trauma upon games also applies to tabletop role-playing games made in Japan or elsewhere?
I'm
And sorry, just to
yeah.
follow up, Deli explains further, I'm curious if this is something that best finds its home in video games or whether tabletop RPGs, which mandate some amount of social interaction, can be or have been used similarly.
Yeah, it's a great question, Deli. Thank you. I admit that I'm not a huge expert in tabletop role-playing games, except for obviously the ways in which Dungeons and Dragons, and they inspired, of course, many of the Japanese role-playing games that then, came out, things like Dragon Quest and, Legend of Zelda and so on and so forth. When I look at, the kind of tabletop games today, if I go into the store and I see them, it strikes me as how they are so complicated. Maybe this is just me because I don't know how to play them well, but so many rules. It's almost like playing a video game. I've sat down with friends around a table, and you have the different characters, the little models, and the tiles and whatnot in different games. The tabletops, kind of setting almost seems to be taking cues from video games, which is interesting because video games obviously took so many cues early on. So, in that sense, I think that, we're seeing rich stories and rich interaction in tabletop RPGs that are similar to the types of kind of interactions that we're seeing in games. So it wouldn't surprise me if we see similar ideas taken up in tabletop role-playing games. I don't know if of any games that deal with the kind of, trauma and anxiety directly, but I'm sure they're out there. And then, as you say, you have the added element of playing, with people in a physical space, right? Which is also something, of course, we can do with video games too. But now I think more and more we're dealing with online worlds. So yeah, it's a really, really interesting question. I don't see why, yeah, we wouldn't see some of these same interactions in tabletop RPGs or tabletop games in general.
Okay, I've kept you for an hour and 10 minutes, and I don't want to keep you for too long. So I'll just jump to the last questions. It's sort of a two-parter
Sure.
from Holly. Returning to earthquake simulation games, is there a form of catharsis for players? While there is discussion surrounding collective trauma and catharsis in disaster-oriented anime films, such as Kimi no Na wa, the catharsis comes from the reversal or possible avoidance of disastrous events. What form of catharsis, if any, do disaster simulation games create?
Right. That's a great question. Yeah, thank you, Holly. Yeah, of course, in Kimi no Na wa, I mean, it also deals with a meteor striking and the sort of, destruction of the Itomori town, right? And in fact, to sort of save that, we kind of go back in time and sort of, through the magic of that movie, we avert the catastrophe. The disaster report game, and I talk primarily about the first game in the series, although there are others, is interesting. It's interesting both because there may not be any catharsis at all, right? I mean, based on the choices you make as a player, you can play through that experience. You can choose to abandon your friends halfway through the game and jump on a speedboat and race away to safety, and then the game ends. And so in that case, it's self-serving, but you're not helping the other non-computer, the computer-controlled characters. Or you can reach the ending where characters tragically die at the end, or where they're rescued. I think the form of catharsis that the game sees is generally sort of the rescue of the main characters. But we also see the more kind of pessimistic, sort of elegiac, to use Susan Napier's term from things like Grave of the Fireflies and others, the sort of pessimism where maybe we don't actually save things, right? And I think that aspect in the game as well, right? That is to say, kind of bearing witness to the fact that, not everybody survives a catastrophe, right? Might be linked to a number of different things. One, Kujo Kazuma took inspiration from other well-known kind of science fiction works like Nippon Shinbotsu, Japan Sinks, which is a well-known science fiction book, but also because he lost, friends as well, right? In the Hanshin quake. So I think that because of that situation, we see that he builds into the game both the kind of, Hollywood cathartic ending where characters succeed and escape, but also the more sort of, tragic ending where they don't. And I think in that way, the game is sort of, bearing witness to a sort of plurality of possibilities that we see in those sorts of situations.
Thank you so much. Thank you. We had a lot more questions, but some of them were touched upon in the talk, and others we just couldn't address due to time constraints. It is 8:15 here in Toronto, and I believe 6:15 in Calgary. So
Yes.
I hope you have a great rest of the evening, Dr. Whaley. Thank you again so much for providing us with your insights and your time. And thank you, everyone, for joining in this evening. Again, our talk will be recorded and it will be uploaded to YouTube at a later date. Dr. Whaley, any last words for our audience?
No, thank you all very much for coming and for your great questions. Thank you to you, Cindy, and to Director Yamamoto, and of course to the Japan Foundation Toronto for supporting my research, as we heard about, but also for organizing this talk. It's been a real thrill. And thank you to everyone. I hope you all keep playing video games and have fun. Have a nice evening.
Good night, everyone.